Hi folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now I had a request some time ago from one of my subscribers and they asked if I would do a video on GABA and GABA supplements. Now this video is going to be loosely based around that topic, but I also want to talk about GABA in food, and I want to talk about the general neurochemistry of GABA and why GABA is such a good anxiolytic compound. So first of all, to begin this video, I need to explain what GABA is. GABA is a non-proteinaceous amino acid, which means that it's an amino acid, but it's not incorporated into protein like most of the other amino acids. It actually has some very special properties that give it some specific functions in the brain, and it's actually used as a neurotransmitter. It's produced in humans, animals, and even bacteria from the amino acid called glutamic acid, and it's produced by the enzyme glutamic acid decarboxylase. And all that happens is a carbon dioxide group is removed from the glutamic acid, and that then produces GABA. So it's a very simple synthesis process from glutamic acid. Now in the brain, GABA has some very interesting properties. GABA is released from neurons, and when it's released from neurons, it enters the space between the neurons, which is sometimes called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, and it attaches to a receptor called the GABA-A receptor. Now there are other GABA receptors, but because this video is really talking about the anxiolytic effects of GABA, the GABA-A receptor is the one that we're interested in. Now the GABA-A receptor is a chloride channel, which means that when it's activated by GABA, the channel opens and chloride ions pass into the cells, and these cells will be other neurons. So the release of GABA has caused chloride ions to pass into the surrounding neurons, and what this actually does is it decreases the membrane potential of those neurons, and by decreasing the membrane potential of the neurons, it actually means that those neurons are much less likely to fire an action potential. So this effectively has an anti-excitatory effect in the brain. It has an inhibitory effect. All of the neurons surrounding the neuron that released the GABA will actually be less likely to fire, and therefore it has a calming effect in the brain. So this is really the overall effect of GABA in the brain. It has a calming effect, a relaxing effect, and this is very well characterized and has been known for a long period of time. If we have a look at the benzodiazepine drugs, which are anxiolytic anti-anxiety drugs, these drugs bind to the GABA-A receptor, and they cause the GABA-A receptor to open, which is, we said it's a chloride channel. The chloride rushes into the neurons, and this decreases the risk of the chance of them firing an action potential. So this is exactly how the benzodiazepine drugs work. They mimic GABA in the brain, and they have this calming effect, which explains their therapeutic use as anxiolytic drugs. So what this video is really about is, can we use diet, can we use supplements to manipulate this effect, and can GABA supplements and GABA in the diet actually have anxiolytic properties? Now, I'm not going to talk about GABA supplements directly, because what I say about GABA in foods will apply to GABA supplements. I'm not a big fan of supplementing with isolated amino acids to treat mental disorders. I have talked about tryptophan, 5-hydroxytryptophan before, and yes, GABA does have a place, and there is evidence that supplemental GABA may have anxiolytic effects, but I feel it's much safer and much more interesting to talk about GABA in foods and GABA in the diet, and then the listener can make up their own mind whether they want to investigate whether supplements would be beneficial. But generally, everything I'm going to say about GABA-rich foods will be applicable to GABA supplements, which are available in a powder or capsules. It's just that they have a much narrower window of safety because they are isolated compounds. Foods are much safer, and as a nutritionist, I'm much more interested in how foods and herbs can affect mental health rather than isolated compounds. That's more like a pharmaceutical effect, and while interesting, I personally think that GABA supplements do have a place in treating anxiety. It's not something really I'm going to talk about extensively in this video. So where do we get GABA from if we want to take a dietary source? GABA is synthesized by animals, by bacteria, so it's widely available in most kind of tissues. But what we're really talking about is concentrated sources of GABA, and these are quite limited in the diet. Now, remember I said that bacteria are able to synthesize GABA from glutamic acid, and this is the clue as to where we can get GABA from in the diet. We can actually use bacteria to synthesize GABA in certain foods, and generally those foods will be the foods where there has been some fermentation. So for example, sourdough bread is sour because it contains high amounts of acids. Now the bacteria that produce those acids also synthesize GABA as a byproduct of the fermentation process. There is GABA in tea, but we can actually increase the GABA content of tea by allowing the tea to undergo a fermentation process in a very similar way to sourdough bread. And generally foods that have been fermented, such as yogurt and some of the soy products like miso, they can contain higher amounts of GABA because of this fermentation process. And this fermentation process has to be undergone under anaerobic conditions, and therefore these fermented foods, tend to have higher amounts of GABA. So for example, there have been a number of studies done on GABA tea and measuring the amount of GABA in GABA tea, which is a basically normal tea that has undergone an anaerobic fermentation under instead of it's not fermented in air, it's fermented under nitrogen, so there's no oxygen there, which allows the bacteria to ferment correctly and allows them to produce the GABA, and this significantly increases the GABA content of the tea. And you can buy commercially available GABA tea, and studies have shown that it has much higher concentrations of GABA compared to normal tea. As you would expect, yogurt has higher amounts of GABA because of the fermentation there. There are these bacteria that ferment these products are acid-producing bacteria such as lactobacillus, and therefore they're in these types of products. So you could, for example, consume GABA tea. You could consume yogurt, which has got higher amounts of GABA in than milk, for example. And miso, which comes from soy, is another fermented product, and sourdough bread. You can, instead of consuming normal bread, if you consume sourdough bread, you'd be consuming higher amounts of GABA. Now that's very interesting, and that's obviously you could simply go to supplements to get the GABA. But the question is, does the GABA actually get into the brain? Because remember, we want the GABA to get into the brain to have its anxiolytic effects. Now a number of studies have looked at the ability of GABA to cross the blood-brain barrier, because obviously once it's in the blood, it has to then cross this barrier that we have surrounding our brain, which is a protective mechanism, and the brain is very selective about what it allows into the brain in order to be able to protect the delicate tissues from, for example, toxins, xenobiotics and other things that might not be conducive to good health. Initially it was thought that GABA is not able to get into the brain. A number of experiments were done, but they were generally done on animals, and there is some question about the methodology of those studies. Subsequently, it's been found that there are GABA receptors on the blood-brain barrier. There are GABA transporters there. There's proteins that will lock onto the GABA. So it's very likely that the GABA is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. But what's very interesting is that some studies have found that the efflux of GABA from the brain is much higher than the influx of GABA into the brain. About 17 times more GABA is effluxed from the brain than is allowed into the brain. So what this might actually mean is that some of the studies that were measuring the influx of GABA into the brain that haven't taken account of the fact that there's a lot of GABA also leaving the brain, they may actually have underestimated the amount of GABA that gets into the brain. So taking that as a whole, there is evidence that GABA is able to get into the brain in small amounts, and actually those studies that have measured small increases in GABA levels from, for example, foods or supplements, may actually have underestimated the amount of GABA that does get into the brain. So I think, this is my opinion, but based on what I've read, I do think that supplemental GABA and GABA from foods would be able to get into the brain, and it would affect brain levels of GABA. And therefore it would have possibly have a calming effect in the brain. However, there's further twist to this story, because studies have been done on mice and other animals, and in particular there was a study that was done on mice where they administered lactobacillus bacteria to the mice. Now those bacteria then were then cultured in the gastrointestinal tract of the mice. And what happened is that those lactobacillus bacteria, remember I said that these fermenting bacteria that produce acid, they also produce GABA as a byproduct of that fermentation. So under the anaerobic conditions of the gut, these lactobacillus bacteria were able to synthesize GABA, and the researchers measured the amount of GABA receptors that were present on the enterocytes of the gut cells of the mice. And what happened is, as the amount of lactobacillus bacteria increased, the number of receptors and proteinaceous subunits of GABA increased in the cells. In other words, the cells were upregulating their response to the GABA. Now, that's interesting, because we know that a lot of the neurotransmitters such as serotonin and GABA have effects in the gut. The gut is kind of like a second brain. It has these connections to the central nervous system, and increasingly the gut is being seen as a kind of a thinking part of the body, and this is possibly where your gut instinct comes from. There's a lot of neurons in the gut, and it's I think there's actually more neuronal tissue in the gut than there is in the brain and the central nervous system. So these neurotransmitters are very important in gut communication. But what was very interesting from this mouse study is that when the lactobacillus bacteria were given to the mice, not only did they have an upregulation of these these subunits of GABA receptors in the gut cells, they also experienced anxiolytic and antidepressive effects. So remember, these bacteria were not in the brain, they were in the gut. Now what's even more interesting in this study is when the researchers severed the vagal nerve, which is the main nerve that travels from the gut cells to the brain, all of the anxiolytic and antidepressive effects of experienced by the mice, they were attenuated. In other words, they disappeared. So what it looks like might happen is that the delivery of GABA to the gut may actually be able to have anxiolytic and antidepressive effects by stimulation of the vagal nerve into the brain. So the GABA may not even need to get into the brain in order to have these effects. And now, if this is true of other compounds that also affect the GABA-A receptor, this is very interesting, because it suggests that those studies that look at the blood-brain barrier as a kind of playing a role in preventing chemicals having an effect in the brain, that might actually be not the whole story, and it might be that some compounds can actually affect the gut, and that in turn then affects how we think and how we the affects our moods, how we think, and may even have cognitive effects. So that's a very interesting study. And it indicates that even if we take in dietary GABA and it doesn't get into the brain, it may still have an effect. So where does this actually leave us in terms of taking GABA as a supplement or taking it in food? There obviously is evidence that taking prebiotics such as lactobacillus, particularly in it's been researched in mice, but it might be the case in humans as well, that they are able to synthesize more GABA in your gut, and that actually has anxiolytic effects. Perhaps if you took supplements of GABA or you took high GABA foods, the GABA that was in your gut would actually have the same effect. It would lock onto receptors, stimulate the vagal nerve, and have anxiolytic effects. Certainly, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that supplemental GABA has an anxiolytic effect. There is a reasonable amount of evidence that high GABA foods and GABA supplements may have anxiolytic effects, but most of that has been done in animals. It's very difficult to measure changes in GABA in the brain of humans. However, having said that, there is a very interesting study that was done on yoga. Now, this is not a nutritional study, but I want to mention this because it's very linked to the study that was done on mice. In other words, do we actually even need to pass the GABA into the brain to have an effect? Well, there was a clinical trial that was done on two groups of individuals, and one group of individuals was asked to perform yoga, and another group of individuals was given instead of the yoga, they were asked to go walking. Now, the amount of exercise these two groups had was matched, so that the actual the amount of exercise was very similar. It was just a different type of exercise. Now, what the researchers found was that those people that underwent yoga had significant reductions in their anxiety levels and significant improvements in their mood, whereas that didn't happen in those people who went walking. So firstly, there's something about yoga. This is perhaps why it's done. Performed in Ayurvedic medicine. And people that have performed yoga, I think, and understand it will maybe say that this is true. There is certainly this perception that it is able to improve your mood and reduce anxiety. And yoga is really not just a form of exercise, but it's a form of mental meditation as well. There are other aspects to it, which is why it was very clever to match it against a form of exercise like walking that doesn't have those aspects. But what was more interesting in this study is that when the researchers analysed the brains of those people that were being performing this study, what they found is that thalamic levels of GABA increased in those people that were performing. There was evidence that there was an increase in GABA in those people that were performing the yoga, but not in those people that were walking. And therefore, what it looks like may have happened in a very similar way to the mouse experiment is that something has increased something has improved, decreased anxiety, improved the mood, and that is related to a change in the neurochemistry of the brain without actually putting anything into the brain. These people didn't take any supplements. There was no drug use. There was no pharmaceuticals that were given. There were no herbs or anything. It was purely the yoga that changed the GABA levels in the brain. And likewise with the mice, there was the probiotics were clearly in the gut, and it was the gut that was actually affecting the brain. So where's this? What as a whole of this video? What's the recommendation? Well, firstly, do these chemicals have to get into the brain? It's apparent that they don't have to get into the brain to be able to have an effect. GABA appears to be able to affect the brain, by doing exercise or by actually taking, beneficial gut bacteria and making sure you have a healthy gut, which is another reason why you should eat healthily, to make sure you have those lactobacillus bacteria in your gut. They're available commercially, but eating yogurt, for example. Yogurt has high amounts of GABA. Yogurt is also able to increase the amount of lactobacillus bacteria that you have in your gut. So there may be a reason why yogurt is such a healthy food. So this is on multiple levels. This is very interesting. I would suggest that GABA does get into the brain maybe in small amounts and does have an effect. But I don't think it has to get into the brain. It appears that this connection between the gut and the brain is pivotal, and I would suggest that this has implications for those people looking at other neurotransmitters such as serotonin. There are serotonin receptors in the gut. The vagal nerve is able to transmit signals from the gut to the brain, and it may be that a lot of people taking serotonin supplements actually maybe not having that serotonin pass into if that serotonin doesn't get into the brain, is that really a bad thing? Can the serotonin act in the gut in the same way as GABA? So a very interesting topic, something to research and look into. My opinion is that high GABA foods such as GABA tea, even maybe GABA supplements, but you have to be careful when you take isolated compounds. They do play a role as anxiolytic agents. One last thing to say on this. The benzodiazepine drugs are used by medicine in order to be able to have anxiolytic effects. We know they affect the GABA A receptor. However, there are a lot of natural compounds, phytochemicals, that are present in herbs that also activate the GABA A receptor. The flavonoids, which I've talked extensively about in my videos, are a group of phytochemicals that are polyphenols, and some of the flavonoids appear to be able to activate the GABA A receptor, and in some cases their affinity for that receptor may be higher than some of the benzodiazepine drugs. For example, some studies have administered flavonoids to culture tissue with GABA A receptors, and the flavonoids are actually able to displace diazepam, which is a benzodiazepine drug, which suggests that the flavonoids have a higher affinity for the GABA A receptor than benzodiazepines. Now, is there any evidence that flavonoids are able to cause an anxiolytic effect from activation of the GABA A receptor? Yes, there is. There's quite a lot of evidence, and that comes from cell culture, it comes from animal experiments, and also human clinical trials as well. Flavonoids appear to be able to activate the GABA A receptor in a very, very similar way to the benzodiazepine drugs. And in particular, the ones that appear to have the most anxiolytic effects that have been identified to date, and doesn't mean that these are the only ones, it's just that means these are the only ones that there is good evidence for. The flavones appear to be particularly beneficial at this, so that's compounds like apigenin, chrysin and luteolin. Now, though, it's interesting that some of the herbs that have very anxiolytic effects have very high amounts of these compounds. So, for example, chamomile tea has high amounts of apigenin in it. Passion flower, which is another herb that is known to have anxiolytic effects, has high amounts of chrysin in it. There have been, many of these flavones have been identified from many of the herbs that have been shown to have anxiolytic effects, and there's a good evidence, I think, that the flavones are particularly beneficial at activating the GABA A receptor. On top of the flavones, some of the flavonols, so quercetin, which is in red wine, it's in tea, it's in onions, camphorol as well. Those two flavonols appear also to be able to activate the GABA A receptor, and they appear to also have anxiolytic effects. And lastly, some of the catechins, particularly epicatechin from tea, appears also to be able to activate the GABA A receptor. So there may be some anxiolytic effects in green tea which have been demonstrated. Very difficult to say whether it's the flavonoids or the L-theanine in tea that are having the anxiolytic effects, but remember, green tea does contain and black tea does contain L-theanine as well, which also has anxiolytic effects. So green tea, black tea may actually be very beneficial because there's more than one compound that can actually have these anti-anxiety effects. So the flavonoids as well, if you eat a high plant diet, the flavonoids do appear to have these same beneficial effects as benzodiazepines, and they're working probably through activation of the GABA A receptor. And based on what we know from the mouse experiment in terms of the lactobacillus, these flavonoids could easily be activating the GABA A receptors in enterocytes, and they could then be transmitting the signal to the brain through the vagal nerve. That's a possibility. It's not been widely researched, and the evidence is very limited for that, but that's just me suggesting that that could be a possibility. I'm going to do a follow-up video to this. My next video is going to be on a theory that I've been developing about whether anxiety and depression could actually be a deficiency of plant food. I've been trying to formulate and collect research, and I've certainly, for anxiety, I think there's good evidence that a deficiency of plant foods in your diet may be one of the causes of anxiety, and it's based largely on the fact that so many of these compounds, not just the flavonoids, but there are lots of other compounds, lots of these phytochemicals in plant foods lock onto the benzodiazepine receptor, the GABA A receptor, and they have a very mild effect on anxiety, but taken as a whole and taken over a lifetime, and the fact that there are many of these compounds in the foods, this could be quite a significant effect. So that's going to be my follow-up video to this, so that will probably be the next video that I make, if you look out for that. So I hope some of the material in this video, it's a very long video, but I hope some of the material was interesting, and it's going to encourage you to do some more research. As always, eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.